And we are live. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We are going to give folks about another 90 seconds to download Ring Central and get logged in, and we will start at about 2:01 and 30 seconds. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm glad you're here, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. My name is Jennifer Bradley. I'm a senior fellow with the Kresge Foundation's American Cities program, and I'll be serving as today's MC. This webinar is the third in a series exploring how the unprecedented flow of federal funds into cities can be used to advance equity, center community voice, wisdom, and priorities, and move away from the status quo towards truly transformative investments. You can learn more about this series and view previous webinars by going to sharedprosperity.org. Today's session is being recorded. It will be shared online in the coming days. And because I know you'll ask, we will be emailing our presenters' presentations as well. As you've probably figured out, participants are going to be in the listen-only mode through the duration of this webinar. We've built in time to today's agenda to answer questions following the presentations. If you have questions, we invite you to share them through the Q&A function at any time during the presentation or the panel discussion. Questions, as I said, will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If you'd like to reduce the clutter on your screen, you can click on the three dots in your own video box, up on the right, and click Hide Non-Video Participants. And that will make some of the boxes that are there for the presenters who are not speaking or our tech and comms folks disappear so that you can concentrate on the brilliance of our presenters. And speaking of our presenters, on today's webinar, we will hear from Lourdes, a senior advisor with the Kresge Foundation and an expert on municipal finance, who will give us a quick update on ARPA regulations and provide a few highlights on key differences and key similarities between ARPA and the infrastructure bill, which we are all still digesting. Then Brad Whitehead, a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Metro, will present some findings from his inquiries into how communities are organizing themselves and working with others to maximize the potential of ARPA funds. Then Brad will move into conversation with Kathy Dahlkemper, the county executive of Erie County, Pennsylvania. Then we will open it up to Q&A for Brad, Kathy, and Lourdes. That is a lot to cover, so let's get started. Lourdes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and joining all of you today. I'm going to begin sharing my screen and cover a very brief presentation to set the stage for the experts that we're going to hear from, including Brad and Kathy. And as Jennifer noted, talking about where are we as we look at these transformative opportunities before us, and specifically to set the stage for the conversation we're going to have today about how do you optimize these opportunities and think about examples of what's happening in the field. So to do that, I'm going to begin and spend the next 5 minutes covering 3 questions. Where do things stand with the American Rescue Plan since its passage in March? What are some of the key commonalities and thorough lines that we see between that and the new recently passed $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act? And when we think about both bills, what's similar and what's different, and what insights does that tell us or begin to tell us about how you should approach both to optimize these opportunities? So we are still in the interim final rule phase for a significant portion of the American Rescue Plan. And that's a key point that'll be a big theme that probably underscores a lot of the insights you'll hear today. Now, to take a step back, the $1.85 trillion American Rescue Plan provided significant dollars that began to flow immediately, almost after its passage in March, with different patterns of spending for natural reasons, including economic payments that reached individuals clearly had a different trajectory than the payments that, at least the first tranche, that cities, towns, and counties across America received in states. When we look at the spending patterns for the $350 billion state and local fiscal recovery funds, there are a couple of insights that really rose to me at the top. So the US Treasury released a report probably about a month and a couple of weeks ago in late October, highlighting the fact that when they looked at states across the board in America and SLRF spending, so the recovery funds specifically flowing to states and localities, only about 45% of states had begun appropriating and spending ARP funds. And that was based on the recovery plan reports the Treasury collected from these jurisdictions in the late summer timeframe, the one annual report where they have to say not only if they're spending, but how they're spending, and also the way that they're framing equity-centered interventions and reporting on those outcomes. 55% of the jurisdictions surveyed had not begun spending. And it's not a surprise because, as I mentioned, even as of today, we still do not have final rulemaking that would give a clear blueprint of compliance, and other than the assurances Treasury has provided that the robust interim final rule and extensive frequently asked questions provide guidance that can be relied on, as if it were final for those who are making tough choices about how to spend these funds today. One remarkable piece that struck me is that even though we have uneven patterns of spending, Treasury did identify 4 core high impact areas that are cutting across the number of projects they are seeing, where jurisdictions are making bold, transformative, and even starting points of seeding projects that with ARP are intended to not only enable a strong recovery, but also to really support the underserved with the very areas that have been hardest hit by COVID. And those are the ones that you see on the far right of this slide. That includes combating the spread of COVID-19, furthering an inclusive economic recovery, making long-term investments, and doing all of those things with a true commitment to equity-centered resident engagement. I'll go over just a few examples, even though there are many in Treasury's recent reports. But these are 3 jurisdictions that, according to Treasury, really highlight what it means to use these funds to combat the spread of COVID-19 and think about inclusive economic recovery. Leon County, for example, spending a significant amount of funds, not only for community engagement, but specifically with a nexus to vaccines, thinking about where underserved communities are comfortable going and thinking about non-traditional providers like churches and other partnerships that could further access to vaccine for unvaccinated populations. Obviously premised on the recognition that we need to leverage every single piece from a public health emergency standpoint to bring back some sense of normalcy and consumption patterns to return. So as we think about inclusive economic recovery, the city of San Jose, in that similar vein, is approaching this by making investments in targeted childcare for vulnerable families, understanding, similar to Orange County in California, how childcare in high poverty areas is absolutely crucial when we think about the kind of workforce outcomes we want to encourage, particularly amongst the hardest hit and underserved communities. And again, the examples that you saw in that slide, including the 3 that I'll go over here, are non-exhaustive. It includes the state of Kentucky elevated for the making of long-term investments across the 3 functional areas of capital investment that were enabled in ARP, including broadband, water, and sewer infrastructure, and also not only generating sort of an eye towards investment with the needs of the underserved, but thinking about the workforce outcomes that could result in the communities where this development takes place. Harris County and Durham were elevated for different reasons, and this is sort of exemplars of the kind of tactics that communities are bringing to the table when they really are centering equity in the equation. Harris County, for example, having had a pre-existing equity framework that they are translating to ARP funds to make sure that they are thinking about their intergovernmental revenues aligned with that broader strategy. In Durham, North Carolina, considering an expansive and robust community engagement to really understand the needs of the underserved, as so many other communities are doing across America. And clearly, you must have heard me mention the word equity and a commitment to resident engagement over probably a dozen times in my remarks thus far. And that's because it's one of the biggest and most significant through lines that's not only present in the American Rescue Plan and like prior recovery packages, but which also is present in a very genuine and strong way in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this is where I'll turn to some similarities and differences between these 2 federal aid packages before us. So as you see here on the left, one of the biggest points that should strike you from just looking at the infrastructure bill is the diversity of functional purposes beyond what's included in ARP that it enables from a capital investment standpoint, including roads and bridges, public transit, Amtrak, power grid, airport improvements, and so many others, including $1 billion to reconnect communities that were bisected by highways many, many years ago in legacy decisions that we've only known the consequences of today for communities of color. One big difference between the bills is the levers that they rely on. So with ARP, similar to the infrastructure bill, we had a significant amount of grant funding, but the infrastructure bill will require awareness and familiarity with a range of public finance tools that are different than direct funding in grant form, including some of the taxonomy of instruments you see here, which are only a snippet of what's covered in the bill: public-private partnerships, revolving loan funds, private activity bonds. I cannot emphasize enough how important it will be for a community who wants to fully leverage this moment in time and the stakeholders who work with them to really have an awareness and at least a fluency with these vehicles, particularly because I'll turn to some insights, centering equity across these different areas. If that is an outcome that you want in your community via the use of these funds, will require intentional and sustained commitments. And that brings me in closing before we turn to our experts, a couple of reflections and insights that I'm having as I'm looking at the similarities and differences between these two aid packages, both of which are time limited. And as we've noted throughout this webinar series, present transformative opportunities for investment. One, even though it is overwhelming to think about wrapping your arms around the minutiae of implementation and the broader strategic overlay and foundation of these bills at this moment in time, it is important to think of parallel strategies, including three that I note here. One, where jurisdictions are using the American Rescue Plan to plug budgetary imbalances, think about what's going to happen when that goes away. Are you taking steps in parallel to the use of our funds and the plan for those funds to make sure that you will have a strong fiscal base? Second, even though the infrastructure bill and ARP provide significant opportunities for capital investment, where will operations and maintenance funding come from? We all know that the end of the story for a facility or infrastructure project is not just when it's placed in service, but assets have a long life cycle. And that kind of thinking is important to do even in the beginning as you seed projects. And finally, think about targeted capacity building. As I mentioned, equity and equity-informed resident engagement is really present throughout the various opportunities that we've talked about for these federal aid packages. Consider that even if you have an equity framework and a strong commitment to that at a citywide, countywide, or state level, will your processes translate when you need to think about the application beyond grants to public finance investments that you may leverage to fully leverage the act? So with that said, none of these questions are insurmountable. It is the perfect moment in time to begin acting, and I'm really pleased to turn the program now to our experts at Brookings in Erie County to begin a conversation about how do we think about lessons from the field to inform what we're seeing in this opportunity for you.
Thanks so much, Lourdes. That was a great tour of the what of the federal funds and a nice insight into Treasury, which is not showing its hand about the final rules, but is telling us what they think good looks like. And for a deeper dive into what good looks like, I am delighted to introduce my friend and teacher, Brad Whitehead, who will do a short presentation and then engage in conversation with Kathy Dahlkemper of Erie County, Pennsylvania. So Brad, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and hello and good afternoon to everybody. Lourdes, you kept referring to Kathy and me as the experts, and I think we're the practitioners and plumbers out here in Erie County in Cleveland, Ohio. We consider you the expert, but we do look forward to sharing some of our experiences. So over the last couple of months, I had a chance to talk to some 30 different communities about the how of their implementing of the ARP local recovery funds in the context of the larger piece. The goal today is to share results of some of those discussions my colleagues and I had to highlight what we think are some of the implications, and then thirdly, as Jennifer indicated, to engage in a discussion with Kathy Dahlkemper, who I thought had one of the most systematic and creative responses among all the groups with whom I interacted. So hopefully there's something in there that's interesting to each and all of you, whether you're from a place that's proceeding cautiously or a place that's proceeding aggressively, because we did see things that were all over the map. But before doing anything else, I do want to thank my two colleagues at Brookings who were my partners in this research, Isaac Velez, who's an engagement intern at Brookings Metro, and Eli Byerly-Duke, who's a senior research assistant there. One of the great things I learned is that it's great to work with Brookings people because they're really smart and make you look good. So thank you, Isaac and Eli. Where I'd like to kind of start the picture is going back really contextually in all this. And of course, we're all familiar with the ARP, but I think it's an important point to note that when this legislation got passed, we were in a different place than we find ourselves now. And while the intent of the legislation is the same, the mindsets that local leaders are bringing to them has evolved. One from how do we manage expected calamity to how do we think about this as a way to tackle some long-standing issues. Because obviously in the municipal finance world, even in the best of times, municipal finance is an exercise in penny pinching. And then when the pandemic came on top of this, it threatened what looked to be real financial, as I said, calamity here. And the situation was dire with government revenues plummeting. In some cases, budget holes of 40% or more were seen in communities as revenues fell and needs for services spiked. And like many of you, I participated in some of those early financial planning scenarios that were really quite grim indeed. And then almost like manna from heaven above in the Sinai came the ARP and the local recovery funds and the rest of the ARP. The potential benefit of this obviously was huge, with the $350 billion flowing to virtually every kind of government in the US, with the purpose of which was to address public health needs and deal with economic damage, particularly in the qualified census tracts, to provide premium pay to essential workers, replace lost fiscal revenues, and to invest in water and broadband infrastructure. So $350 billion as part of the $1.9 trillion is a lot of help. And it's important to note that while we get focused in on the $350 billion, it is important to see that in the larger context of the dollars flowing into communities. And then, as Lourdes just indicated, on the back of this now we have the infrastructure package and potentially additional federal revenue on top of that. So what that means is, I think kind of what we're seeing is the mindset beginning to shift as we considered how to deal with these dollars. First is that while the fiscal situation is tough, it's not as bad as we thought it might have been in those early days. For one thing, we had the drop off in retail and consumer, but that was offset, at least in some measure, by produced goods. And then we see that the economy has bounced back, some would say not as robustly as we wanted, and certainly unevenly, but the economy has bounced back such that the fiscal revenue situation is somewhat better than we may have feared. And second is, with these ARP dollars, what we start to see is kind of enormous sums of money. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. We're getting $511 million in ARP, and that's against an annual city budget of $1.8 billion. And then when you throw in all the 161 other entities in the metro areas, that's $1.3 billion flowing into the economy. And I think what that has led to is these alternative views of what the ARP and the fiscal recovery funds really are. For some, it remains the one-time boost to get the economy back on track, but for others, is it a sustained platform for getting to prosperity and the achievement of some of these long-standing civic priorities? For some places, it continues to be a standalone program, and for others, though, we see this, the other parts of ARP, the infrastructure and other funding streams, it's now an integrated mosaic of capital sources. And finally, then that begs the role is, what is the role of the elected official in all that then? Are they first violinists figuring out how to spend their money, or to what degree is the fiscal the elected official and public official and orchestra conductor trying to manage and engage all sorts of other community stakeholders? And that's really the work that my colleagues and I did. There's been a lot on the what of the actions in ARP. For instance, Brookings Metro has this excellent Metro Recovery Watch, which outlines some of the things that communities are out and doing. What Eli, Isaac, and I were diving in on was the how. How have local governments gotten themselves organized to respond to the ARP? And are there practices out there that may be instructive to others? And we were really looking at these questions of what's the mindsets that people have brought, what are the organizational forms, the collaborations that they formed, and the instruments that they've deployed. Our work occurred really in two phases. First, we talked to a bunch of experts out there, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and so on. And then we went out and talked to as many different communities as we could to understand what was going on. 3 lessons at the highest level, and I do encourage you to read the full report here. I'm just going to have a chance to give you just a quick flyby. The first, as Lourdes indicated, is local governments have been slow to spend, and I think that's generally a good thing. given what's happened, we're going to talk about two kinds of slow. The reasons we heard for the slow spending, and Lourdes indicated the first of these, is that there is a lack of regulatory certainty, given that we haven't gotten the final guidance from Treasury. For some, that's caused them to be frozen. But then there are others who've chosen to put a stake in the ground. You'll hear from Cathy in a moment where, I talked to one county who said, look, we have no idea. Brownfields are a big part of what we do, but we just can't know whether Treasury is going to allow that. Where I think Cathy and her colleagues said, look, there's a pretty clear case to be made that this is an important part of quality of life. We can go do that. But for many, this lack of regulatory uncertainty has caused them to go slow. Second, while there is this mosaic of funding, you heard people talking about, well, I don't know what to spend money on, because I could go do this water project here, but with the infrastructure bill coming, maybe that water project will be paid for that, and I don't want to spend my resources here if that's coming, so maybe I'll put it into broadband, but oh wait, maybe there's broadband funding coming. And so it becomes this giant exercise in strategic game theory, which can be overwhelming for some. But then you get places like Greater Minneapolis-St. Paul in Minnesota, who established a federal funding hub where they started stitching together what are all the sources of federal funding that's coming down? How do those play out with each other? And how can we make decisions under that uncertainty with that sort of mapping? Third, and this is perhaps the most important, is after decades of squeezing down local government, many simply lack the capacity to work strategically, which causes them to work expediently and maybe not as fast as they otherwise would. But again, the counterfactual on this are places like King County, Washington, and elsewhere who said, well, we're going to boost capacity in order to do that. And in some places, they're even saying we're going to use ARP money in order to do that, to plan well, because we know that to spend money well, we need to boost capacity. So that's finding number one, and that leads to this idea that there's two kinds of slow. There is what the mayor-elect in my community, Justin Bibb, talks about as being deliberate urgency, which means we get going on the planning, and then there is the idea of, well, we have to wait until what we hear. So takeaway number one is proceed deliberately, even if we're taking our time. The second finding was that we thought we were going to be seeing all kinds of transformational programs coming out of this, just given the sheer quantity of dollars flowing through. And in fact, for the most part, we saw money being largely pushed out the door. And that is, in our mind, or in my mind, a lost opportunity. And it may make sense to be pushing the money if you're a small city or a township, but if you've got 50 million or more, this is an opportunity to be thinking bigger, or at least to be making explicit choices. And we set forth several dimensions here about, you could think about the frame with which you address ARP planning, the degree to which you view it as near-term versus long-term systemic recovery, whether we're trying to deal with a whole breadth of issues, or we're going to move our chips onto a couple of squares and try to go big. The geographic reach of the money came to my community, I'm going to work in my community, versus I'm going to work across jurisdictionally on issues that cross boundaries. And then the degree to which I'm looking at just this ARP, local recovery funding, versus looking at it and it's in the broader context. Cathy will talk, I think, a little bit about that in some of the choices she made. But as we looked across, obviously there's many permutations and combinations of what this could be, but there generally seem to be four archetypes that emerged. The first is on just simply budgetary gap filling, and I think Lourdes pointed to the need for that, given that this is a one-time infusion, and now we have this work from home world where there may be a reduction, long-term reduction in some revenues. And so while the legislation doesn't allow us to create rainy day funds, there are many who are thinking about how can I make this infusion last over time. Second, and most common, would be project-based relief. And this is specific direct support to individuals and businesses, looking a lot like the CARES program, but it's in rental relief, small business, restaurant relief, and things of that sort. The risk, of course, here is that we have a peanut butter approach to what we do and that it may not have staying power over time. Third of those places that chose, as in the case of Erie, where I think Kathy took 37, 38% and pushed it into two areas of saying, I'm going to move the needle on a couple of specific things. Most commonly, those have been in workforce and in homelessness and in broadband. And people doing that of saying, well, while ARP kind of blinks and nods towards grant-based funding, it does appear to allow a broader set of instruments, including revolving loans, ISAs, and income share agreements, and things of that sort. So some real clever actions on these sorts of projects. And then finally, we saw almost no examples of communities that are really thinking about comprehensive transformation and mapping the ARP with other federal funding flows against their overarching strategies and thinking of it in that more holistic context. So if there's a lesson to be learned from this one, it's that hopefully we can take at least a portion of our allocation on a few big moves in the context of these larger priorities. Third and final one that I want to highlight here today is our work initially started with the idea that we're going to look for cross-institutional collaboration, that given that every government in a geography seemed to be getting funding, perhaps they're all working together. And in fact, we saw a limited amount of that. Yes, people are reaching out to get input on their plans. Yes, there are places seeking alignment, but there's not a lot of really shared dollars in and around joint funding of initiatives. But there were exceptions to that. Typically, it was from a higher level of government, a county or a state. We use a couple of examples here, for instance, in Indiana with the Regional Economic Acceleration and Development Initiative, which is providing up to $50 million in funding for communities that will work together on their economic strategies and plans. I think the announcements are coming out this month, and other examples of as well of where, like I said, counties and states encouraging multi-jurisdictional collaboration. I think you'll hear more again from Kathy on this as well. Which begs the question here of the kinds of collaborations that are out there. Now, given different objectives and different starting situations, there didn't seem to be a common answer to way people were organizing tables. Most places had a table of some sort, and what we saw is a typology that varied by who are the kinds of members at that table. Is it just the ARP-funded government entities? Is it all the funders? It is additional stakeholders? How many tables? Purpose of the table? Scope of the table, activities, breadth, and facilitation. We don't have time to go into all this today, but I think it's important as you think about your tranche 2 funding and the next round of engagement that there are explicit choices to be made about who comes together and how. And I guess the final piece I'll make here on this finding, it struck us that there may be a no regrets move here. That given all the other choices that you have, that you are likely to benefit in a region by establishing some sort of coordination tower that includes the ARP and other federal funded entities and perhaps other major civic funders, where you have a chance to set goals and objectives, coordinate and align investments, pursue new sources of funding, whether that be EDA or others, and make course corrections as necessary to ensure that it has adequate staff, to ensure that inclusion is systematically brought into the work. And then it's a place to be able to connect with the big transformational issues that you may be pursuing. So the takeaway there is that there's a benefit to having a table, and this idea of a coordination tower makes sense. In our report that you can find, we talk about 7 actions that make sense. Deliberate urgency, taking the time to do it right. Working collaboratively with others, thinking of this as a potluck, it's not room service. to do a federal funding mapping to understand what are my sources of funding, what are the uses of funding, and how do those marry up. It's an analytic exercise that will benefit one from going through. Fourth is ensuring that you have capacity to do this well. Fifth, to be utilizing non-grant instruments. My reading of the guidelines suggests that it is plausible and can make sense. Sixth, to create a federal funding hub. People are starved for information about what's allowed and what they can go find and pursue. And finally is to go boldly somewhere. Pick at least one or two, maybe three major areas for sustained transformational impact. And those would seem to be some no regret actions that communities can take. I just note that my colleagues at Brookings Metro, under the leadership of Livia Brockman and Alan Berube, are pursuing putting together a cohort of communities that want to put some of these things in motion, and more to follow on that. So with that, let me now pause and turn it over to the conversation with Kathy from Erie County, Pennsylvania. She was working with $52 million against her $500 million county budget. What made that case particularly interesting to me was these things you see on the right here. Within weeks of the legislation passing, she had set up a committee that was meeting bi-weekly and then monthly to get to a planning process that allowed her to get this money out the door. She had the courage to take a stand on the guidance, as I mentioned, around the industrial brownfields. She is using non-grant instruments, revolving loan funds and the like. She's working through partners. She has taken money and put it in the hands of the partners to spend as opposed to trying to control it herself. She's established a community future center to try to leverage additional funding. She's chosen to go big in a couple of areas. Some 37% of that funding is going in these two areas. And finally, as she's put carrots in there to encourage collaboration among cities within fire and safety, for instance, multi-city applications for funding had a chance to get more money than those who came in alone. So with that, Kathy, let me stop sharing my screen, start talking to you. First of all, is there anything you want to do to correct the record on what I just said about why it was so great what you're doing?
Thanks, Brad. It's great to be with you and great to be with everyone here. Pretty much everything you said is correct. There's a little bit of a change in the percentage simply because the county budget was passed last week, and the amount that is being sent to what we call our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission has been reduced next year from $6.5 million to $3.5 million, but that other $3 million is not been put in any other categories, so that will be available maybe for them to come back in 2022 and put that back with that commission. Otherwise than that, I think everything you said is still in play.
Great. So Kathy, I wondered if you could just help us get into your head of what was going on when this went on. As you went through this process of allocation, what, if anything, was a governing philosophy or mindset that you had, and did that change and evolve over time?
I think the main philosophy that we had from the onset was that this could not be business as usual, that we had to think differently, that we had to think boldly. You know, our community has suffered, as many others are up here in the Northeast, with the industrial decay of this region, and we've not seen great times for a long time. But we all felt like we were coming back, and we had a lot of really good plans in place. We were starting to move on those plans, and then COVID hit. So of course, a delay in us moving forward, but a lot of positive things happening. So here we now had great plans and great actions set to go, but now we also have money, which is something, as you said, we don't normally have. So we're trying to cobble that together from many sources. So we have to think of this differently. We have to do this in a very collaborative way. If we don't do it, we're going to miss this moment in time, and we're going to continue to struggle as we have for decades.
Well, you said we have to work collaboratively, but actually you don't. There's a lot of places that aren't. I'll notice you showed a real strong willingness to work through partners, whether it was the Revenue and Gaming Commission, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission that you set up, which I actually think is pretty rare to see. And I'm just wondering if you could speak about that, and whether the fact that you are retiring at the end of the year, did that help in any way, shape, or form?
Well, it might have helped somewhat because people see that I don't have a political piece to this, right? But county government is not really set up to do some of this work. That's just not in our wheelhouse. But we have other entities who do this and do it very, very well. So we have a gaming revenue authority that was set up here many years ago when we got our first casino. They do a lot of granting. And so for us to look at setting up a new program around transformational grants didn't make any sense, but it made sense to put it in the hands of the entity who actually does this work on a daily basis. When it came to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission, so this is a brand new commission. They have just been formed and they are just up and going and getting all of their bylaws and things like that put together. But it was actually the community of color who came to us and said, we need to make our own decisions. We need to create our own destiny. Because in the past, it's always been, yeah, you can have this, you can have that. But what we need, what we know we need for our community, we often don't get. So this is an opportunity for that community to truly take these funds and change the trajectory of these communities who have been left behind for generations. And we really saw the equity issue embedded in this legislation. And we felt that that was something we had to address. And this is our way to address it here in Erie County. So they have been awarded $3.5 million in the first tranche and $3.5 million in the second. And they have also been charged to go out and find a whole lot more funds, to use this, to leverage that, and to be able to really create some of the programs and projects that they need to create to move that community forward.
Did you get much pushback from county council on sort of delivering I don't want to say a blank check, but an open-ended check to an outside, a newly formed entity like that?
There was a lot of trepidation, I have to say that. And it's probably one of the reasons why they took them back to $3.5 million for the second tranche to see how things go. It is a risk to start this new entity and to give them this control over this much of that money. But I think once, those 9 people have now been chosen, they have come together, people see the quality of what they're doing already, and they haven't spent a dime yet. But I think that they will prove themselves to be good stewards of this money. But again, it's really up for them to prove this and for them to leverage this and do what they said they want to do.
Yeah, good, thank you. You mentioned that you had kind of these strategies, but not as much funding as you needed, and then the legislation came. You had a very intensive process on the front end. At least it seemed intensive to me. You might not describe it as an intensive, but it seemed that way. I wonder if you might describe the process a little bit and what worked well about it and what you might change if you were to run it again.
So even before the legislation had passed, County Council had brought together a committee to look at the effects of COVID-19 on our community and what might need to be addressed going forward. So they started those meetings back in, I believe, January. And then when we really saw the ARP was moving, was going to most likely pass, we said, we've got to do something, again, different from the way we've normally done this. So on April 1st, shortly after legislation had passed, I convened the first meeting of stakeholders, of recipients of the funding, as well as other funders in our community. So our community foundation, the Gaming Revenue Authority, some of our other, our largest corporations who are funders in our community. And those meetings, it took a while to gel, but the first thing we did is we told people to come with a different mindset, drive a different way to the meeting. We actually had them in person. This was for many people, this was the first time meeting in person since COVID began. And we went to the convention center. So we all had our own space and we wore masks. So we were very safe, but we felt we needed to be in the room together. And this process went on, like you said, bi-weekly for quite a while. One of our final meetings was probably one of the most important meetings I've ever been to in our community. We didn't expect it to go this way, but it came into this huge community discussion about racism. And people were very open and honest, and it was a hard discussion to have, but it was a necessary discussion. So I think it was really important for us to come together like this. Like I said, those who were getting the majority of the funds coming in, as well as other funders and stakeholders, came together as we really started to lay out what would be the priorities. We did surveys and with this group and with some other stakeholders, and we started to lay out what would be the top priorities for our community with this opportunity, this, as they say, moonshot moment.
Yeah. So you chose to meet face to face. You got all the funders in the room. You started with the plans that you had. You kind of met intensively. Anything that you would have changed?
I'm not sure what we would have changed at this point because we were pretty committed to moving forward. I mean, there's always more people you could have invited. There's more meetings you probably could have had, and to bring in more and more voices. But I think we had the best representation around the table that we, could possibly get in the moment, I guess. I'm not sure what I would have changed at this point. I wish I was going to be here longer to help move it forward, but I am moving on, so others will have to do that.
Yeah. I hope you don't mind my sharing. When you and I talked, I thought it was funny. You said, wow, if I'd known this local recovery funds were coming, I might have run for re-election.
That's right. That's right. Because it is a great opportunity. And there was, for me, there was definitely a sense of urgency around this because I wanted to help, move this in the way I felt was best for the community that I know and love so well. The other thing we did was we hired experts to help us. I was actually at a National Association of Counties meeting this summer, met some individuals from a great firm, and they have been hugely important to helping us really understand what we can and cannot do with this money. And that I would really recommend to any entity to find some of those experts. They are worth, the consulting fee they will charge you, which wasn't that great. I mean, it was much small piece of what we're spending, but definitely to keep us from, concerns down the road with misspending this money in any way. We wanted to have someone verify what we wanted to do could be done.
Well, speak to me a little bit more about the effective capacity, because there are places that have hired new staff to do that. I had a chance to connect with some of your staff, and they seemed pretty energized, pretty tired.
Right. They have great staff, and I demand a lot out of them, and they always rise to the occasion. But the other thing we didn't want to do was hire a lot of staff that in 3 or 4 years from now I'm going to have to let go, or somebody else is going to have to let go. So that's always an issue, right? If you don't have the money coming in, then you're going to have to either find another way to fund them, or you're going to have to remove them from your staff. So we felt like using some outside consultants was really best, but we are very fortunate to have some very talented people in county government. We have not added any staff at this point, and I don't expect that will happen. And then the other piece is this Community Future Center, and it's not a brick and mortar center, of course, but it's an RFP that we put out to have, I guess it would compare it somewhat to your federal funding mapping capacity, because that is, to me, the real opportunity. Beyond our 52 million is what about all the other funding that's out there, and how does that play into what we're doing with our money, or what the city, our cities or townships or boroughs are doing with their money, or our universities, or whoever else has that money. This Community Future Center is supposed to come in and help map that out and keep these projects moving with the varied sources of funding that are going to be or currently are available.
Yeah. And, I don't know if there's a response required here, but I think we have a major moment now that my sense is a lot of communities have gotten tranche one, at least allocated, maybe not expended, but allocated into broad buckets. But, tranche two is a major reset point. I know you've moved on tranche two. Most places haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a chance now, I think, to step through some of these practices and say, okay, what did we learn? And, what do we want to do now in terms of the mapping, the other federal pieces, the engagement, and so on. So.
And the piece that we have actually truly partnered with someone is on the industrial light remediation piece. And that we've done that with the city of Erie, who these locations are all within opportunity zones. So we're kind of layering on top of that. And that we've pretty much put in not exactly the same amount of money, but close to it for these projects. And I think it's going to make a huge difference in these very much developed and neglected often neighborhoods in our community.
Yeah, Jennifer, I see a lot of questions coming in, but I do want to put a pin on this one for a moment. Speak to me a little bit about the industrial revitalization and the decision to proceed on that one, was that a hard decision? Because again, talking to others across the US, they seem frozen on that one until they hear more from Treasury.
Well, I guess we could wait on Treasury, but these projects need to move forward. And, you know, again, one of the blighted industrial sites we're taking down had become a haven for a lot of drug misuse and, you know, other things that you want out of your community. And that area is going to actually be turned into a park. It's right next to kind of a public housing area and in a section of town that doesn't have a lot of green space. So you put that with your beautiful and vibrant neighborhoods, and we believed it was a winner. And we, you know, again, used our consultants to really dig in on this, and they believe it also fits into that. And so we felt like we could move forward on that, and that's the kind of thing that we wanted to do. But I had to have somebody else kind of, you know, give us the justification that yes, we could do this.
Yeah. Jennifer, just before I turn it back to you, I wonder, a final question I have for you, Kathy, is how did you think about just the strategic allocation of okay, this is going to be for my big bets, this is going to be for my fire and safety? What was the process for getting to saying 35% for these things and 5% here, and this will be peanut butter here, but this is going to be a lot of chips over here?
So some of it's political, and some of it is actually leaning on my leadership in my team. So yes, fire and safety is a big political issue. You got to give them something, right? And they need something, but they probably didn't need the big pot of money. So we've got a nice pot of money that we actually are using for 3 different areas. We're doing scholarships right now. We're running through our community foundation for people to go and become EMTs and paramedics. And we also are helping them out with our operational budgets. And we're also doing that transformational piece if they work with other communities to merge, maybe they're volunteer fires or whoever it might be that would help them become more regional, and they're thinking they're going to get more money for that. So that's something you have to do because it needs to be done, but it's also a good political thing to do, and you can get the votes then you need on county council. But then, you know, let's look at the more transformational things, and that's really where we went with the big dollars to try to really move the needle in this community.
Thanks so much, Brad and Kathy. We have an active chat. Folks are really curious to learn more. Lourdes, though, I want to bring you back in, first of all, because I think you'll field some of the questions, but also how did Brad and Kathy's presentation kind of match what you're seeing from your perch, right? You talk to a lot of cities, you're involved in a lot of collaboratives. Are there things that you particularly wanted to highlight or pull through from what we've just seen?
Yeah, and so many wonderful points. I'll isolate just 3 brief ones, but when Brad talked about that you can consider how there are different archetypes of communities that and different strategies tied to how you entered COVID and whether or not your consumption patterns have caused a certain degree of dislocations, which are either severe to the not severe. I think that's a really big insight that we often don't hear in these conversations. There is no one size fits all approach. And even though everyone was in a significant situation none of us expected at the start of COVID, we weren't all in the same boat. And I think that really looking at conditions in sort of that year into entry of COVID is also really informative for the kind of strategies that might be the highest points of leverage for your community. And I can't stress enough the point about cross-institutional collaboration. That's going to become so important, particularly when you prepare yourselves to fully leverage the infrastructure bill and look to provisions that might be relevant, like state loan forgiveness for certain programs or the use of revolving funds and others. And I think when Kathy mentioned the kind of investment that she made and saying we either could have funded, you know, additional staff, but we chose not to do that, recognizing that these are time limited funds, but still finding other avenues to have the resources for compliance. That's really important because this bill, you know, the American Rescue Plan provided significant latitude in how you would think about data measurement and the capacity to know that you are making strong choices that would hold up over time, particularly when you got to audits and clawbacks. And I think it's important to surface the continuum of strategies that while it is admirable to have staff roles, there are other ways to do this that are thoughtful as well and important.
Great. Really appreciate that kind of national perspective added. A little bit of moderator privilege. Cheryl R. in the chat asked how she could find out, or how everyone can find out, what their own local governments have done with ARPA funding. I'm not going to ask the panelists that. I know friends from the Urban Institute are on this, are in the audience, and I strongly encourage them to put in some of the resources that they've been working on around what we've called Follow the Money. It was the subject of our previous webinar, so I invite them to put resources in the chat to follow. You know, related though to this question of capacity, Kathy, a question that came for you is, what was the role of other funders in thinking this through? The role of your community foundation. You mentioned private sector entities that had that have invested in the community. How did they come together in the prioritization exercise or in any kind of handoff?
So they were all involved in those meetings that we had, that we were having bi-weekly, and so their input was brought into that conversation. And it's not that we have a firm commitment for them that they're going to, you know, match the money, but their commitment basically was, we now have strong public funding. We can come forward and continue to fund a number of these projects. So again, in the past, we really struggled with getting some other funders besides public funding. And these funders have come through most recently prior to COVID, well, as we were really moving these plans forward. So now they're in the game, I guess is the best way to put it. And so having, you know, this strong funding ability from the public side actually gives them more incentive to even invest further. But they were at the table. I brought them in from day one to be part of this conversation, to have input, you know, to help guide where the priorities would go.
And we have a related question about input, and this is from Livia Brockman at Brookings. And she says, how does the public perceive these innovative approaches and priority setting? In Detroit, for example, and I've got some Detroit colleagues in the audience, so they can correct me in the chat if I mischaracterize this, but there were a series of public meetings and listening sessions to understand, okay, what's the priority of residents? How was resident input kind of brought in, and are you staying with them to find out, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down as this rolls out?
Are you asking me that from
Yeah.
your kind of side? So the public input, I don't think we didn't do as much public input as I've heard a lot of other communities doing. And actually the city of Erie has done a lot more public input than the county has with our funding sources. So so I guess I'm just going to put that out there, that we did not. We used the stakeholders. So for example, our community centers, they were very involved in these meetings, as were our multicultural resource center. So some of the leaders within those communities, and then they were bringing to us what their constituents were telling them, and that's how we did that.
Got it. Brad, did you find examples of robust community engagement in your research?
Yes, and it was everything you might expect. From probably the most I saw was people setting up web presences to gather input and ideas and so on. But then also community listening sessions as well. So I'm not sure there was anything that I would say really pushed the stakes out further beyond what we traditionally think of, though, in terms of community engagement.
Got it. Got it. Lourdes, two questions for you. One is if you have any insights on the community engagement, right? Because I think to get transformational investments, we probably need different kinds of processes than we've had before. So that's one. And second, we have a question again about data and evidence being used to set priorities for funding and identify investments. And I think the question was specifically for Kathy, but I know, Lourdes, that you're involved in a lot of community work or work with cities that talk a lot about data and evidence. So if you could take those two very large, complicated questions and
Sure. And there's sort of a commonality between how I'll address both of them. But I think on community engagement, I would challenge individuals to think about whether or not you are committed to equity in your process or as an outcome, and making sure that you are not just tracking who comes to the table and how many meetings you have, all the things that are easy to document, but to the extent that actual resident priorities reflect different socio-demographic factors of individuals who might otherwise not come to the table, but whose voices are important. And second, how even across your entire population, once you have an engagement process, you are translating what you hear into priorities that inform decisions. Because those are two separate things. You can host a process, but there might not be a nexus to what you actually do on the ground. And second is with data and evidence, I think that the recovery plan reports, especially for those who are looking for comparable jurisdictional examples, contain a wealth of information that is in the public domain. There are different organizations that have started to link databases saying, like, let's look at these 150 or this subset of cities and what they're putting in their reports. But what you'll learn from that is how communities are telling the stories of outcomes, and specifically, what are they saying they believe in their jurisdiction will move forward the social determinants of equity in a place. And that, to me, has been really eye-opening because it both shows the capacity for impact measurement that exists on the ground in cities, and also what's feasible to measure with data limitations that might push your own understanding of what you can do in your jurisdiction. And all of those are public. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack, though, when you look for them, for specific cities who are all entitlement cities or states or counties.
But that, if there could be a rubric for scoring opportunities, it would be great. I didn't see it, and I'm now working with our mayor-elect, and we're trying to find a rubric for setting up our Office of Economic Recovery. To me, that would be a marvelous area to work. And Lourdes, to your point, it's going to vary by place as to what we value. But I didn't see a lot of really great rubrics.
We have time for one question, and I will again direct this, I think, to Brad and Lourdes, who probably have the biggest synoptic kind of overview. Are there examples or best practices of local governments aligning with state governments to maximize impact and coordinate efforts regarding ARPA? Brad, anything come to mind?
Well, yes, a couple. The READY program in Indiana, where the state is using its ARP allocation to focus on economic acceleration. Then there's the California Resilience Fund, where I think the governor asked for $750 million, they got $600 million, which is for local regional communities to offer what they need to do. And Wisconsin has got one. I don't recall. I think it's anywhere from $250,000 to $10 million. Everybody, I think, gets a planning grant, but then it's competitive to get a workforce grant about how we're going to get people prepared and back in the workforce, and it's quite broad in terms of what they do. And to me, there's real magic in states and counties doing this sort of thing to encourage the behavior that they want to see in local governments.
Got it. Lourdes, real quick from you.
I will echo that. I was actually going to cite the California example as one of the more forward thinking, and that also elevates something we talked about before, the importance of thinking of the continuum of what you can do with co-investment to really support the strategies you see with ARP. And I also will raise the state of Kentucky. I saw a number of recovery plan reports for localities and counties when I was doing sort of an initial review, and that really seemed to be in sync, even if not explicit, with the state's investments across the three functional areas of capital, and saying, maybe we're not investing in this area because we expect investments to flow from other sources, and really calibrating the highest and best use of dollars in view of the expansive role the state would take with respect to infrastructure. And this was even before we knew that the infrastructure bill would pass.
Great. Judging from the energy of the chat and all the things that participants have to say, I know that we could keep going for another 30 minutes, but we do want to end on time so that people can go about implementing these ideas and carrying on the learning that they need to do around ARPA and the infrastructure bill. I just can't thank you enough. Brad, Kathy, Lourdes, also my colleagues who helped us present this webinar. We will be sharing a link to this recording with all of the registered participants, and we will include a way to access the various presentations, and we'll also put in any of the links that came up in the chat, whether that's the Urban Institute's formerly known as Opportunity Zone scoring tools, or a variety of the reports, the summary of Brad's research. So thank you all. Really appreciate you joining us. Thanks again to the panelists, and I hope everyone has a joyous and revivifying end of 2021 and brings great energy into greater equity in their places for 2022. Thanks very much, everyone.